This episode of The Ready Room is brought to you by the Star Trek Starships Collection from Eaglemoss, the ultimate collection officially authorized by CBS Studios featuring vessels from 50 years of Star Trek. Each is expertly sculpted, hand-painted, and comes with an authoritative collector's magazine. Start your collection today with the USS Enterprise 1701D for only $4.95 with free shipping. For details and to order, visit st-starships.com/readyroom. And by Audible.com, offering more than 150,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. If you love podcasts, you're going to love Audible.com and the ability to read your favorite books, plus those you've been wanting to get to, while on the go or at work. To get a free audiobook of your choice, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter. Visit enterpriseinspace.org for more details.
Hi, this is Michael Dorn, Lieutenant Commander Worf from Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Welcome to The Ready Room, show number 209. Just don't smell the flowers. I'm Christopher Jones, and with me this week is Bruce Gibson. We'll be talking about some Star Trek news, including the latest details about Star Trek Discovery, and word that a Deep Space Nine documentary is headed our way in 2017. Then in the feature, we're joined by Luke Weir to discuss the Next Generation episode, Justice. So let's step into The Ready Room. Hello, Bruce. It's great to have you in the Ready Room with me for the first time ever. I can't believe that this is the first time we've ever recorded a podcast together because we've been talking for so many years, and of course, you co-host Literary Treks here on the network.
Yeah, it's really strange that this is the first time because I started listening to this show about 2 or 3 months after it premiered, and I've been here ever since. And then I've been over at the 602 Club and Literary Treks, and I have to tell you, it's very clean in the Ready Room compared to the 602 Club. I like it here. It's very comfortable.
Well, that's because I make Zachary and Mike keep their little cot area over there clean on the other side of the room.
Oh, is that who's sleeping over there?
Yeah, they're always sleeping. That's why they're co-hosting so often. But
okay.
They're on vacation. I think they went to some planet called Rubicun III for vacation right now.
Well, that sounds like a really great place to go on vacation.
I just hope they don't step on any flowers.
No, I can imagine they're worn out. So I'll try to keep it down and not try to wake them up.
So, of course, we are going to talk about Justice in the feature today. But before that, we have a couple of news items that we want to talk about. And Bruce, Larry, and I just hopped on and did our special show about Star Trek Discovery. So people are going to hear me talking quite a bit about these items in the Ready Room that comes right before this one, a special Ready Room. Today, I really want to get your thoughts on the Star Trek Discovery news. We learned so many things recently from Brian Fuller. 4 items that we pulled out to talk about today are the time period, the ship design, the point of view, because the lead character is not going to be the captain, and crew diversity. So starting with time period, are you getting something that you thought you were going to get? Are you excited about being 10 years before Kirk's missions?
I'm a little bit excited about that. I'm surprised that they're doing in this time frame because I remember so well when Star Trek Enterprise came out, and of course it was called just Enterprise at the time, and just the reaction from fans of, no, Star Trek goes forward. We don't want to go back. Not a prequel. No. And I felt like out of all the Star Trek series that premiered, I mean, Next Generation in the beginning wasn't received real well in the beginning. People didn't want to see a different crew outside of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. But this one seemed really harsh, and maybe because the internet was more prominent at that time, so I could hear more opinions. So I was surprised that they would go yet to another prequel. And I try not to think of this one as a prequel as much as just a series that's taken place in the Kirk era. And who doesn't want to go back to that era? So I'm really looking forward to see how they handle that, how they make everything fit in story and design. It sounds interesting to me. I'm excited about it.
Yeah, people throw the word prequel around a lot, and it often has a negative connotation. I like what you said. Don't think of this as a prequel. Think of it as a series set in the mid to late 23rd century that comes before Kirk's missions. It really is filling in gaps in the timeline more so than being a prequel, at least in my mind.
Yeah, a lot of people have been asking for a series that takes place between the undiscovered country and the start of the Next Generation. Well, wouldn't that be considered a prequel too? Because we've gone beyond that time period to the end of Voyager and such. So, any time in the timeline works for me. As long as it's Star Trek with some good stories, bring it on. I like filling in all the gaps.
A lot of people see it, I think, as a challenge for the writers to stay within canon, and they see this as a hindrance because not only do they now have to take into consideration everything that was established by Enterprise, they also have to take into consideration the original series, particularly being set so close to it, as well as the Next Generation and everything that came beyond that. But I would say that it's a challenge to fans to be more open-minded about creativity and to be flexible and to accept that something that was written 50 years ago is by nature going to be a bit different than what you would write today, and that there has to be a flexibility in the creative process. And then you as a viewer figure out how to fit that all together so that it works for you. We talk about headcanon a lot on Trek FM. And of course, you guys talk about headcanon a lot on Literary Treks, which I used to co-host with Matthew, because you have to, because it's the novels, right? And you have to figure out how that stuff fits in with what's on screen. So I would hope that as viewers, people will be a bit more flexible and open-minded and allow this to fit into the overall Star Trek timeline through their acceptance.
Well, and it can't fit in to look and feel exactly like a show did 50 years ago.
Exactly.
I mean, we're at the 50-year mark. Who would expect another series to fit in perfectly with a show from 50 years ago? I mean, just picture another 50 years from now. If they're making Star Trek 100 years from the premiere of the first series, it's not going to look exactly like and fit in perfectly with that series also. So you kind of have to allow there to be some flexibility in the look and some of the storytelling. It'd be great if it all fits, all the series fit in perfectly with each other, but as a franchise grows bigger and bigger over time, it's not going to fit perfectly. It's not a perfect puzzle piece. So yeah, keep an open mind with it. And just enjoy it for what it is and enjoy it as Star Trek.
Yeah, excellent advice. Ship design, let's talk about that. Now, Brian Fuller has already said that the ship design has been evolving since what we saw in the teaser trailer. Larry and I, on the previous Ready Room that people will hear, talked a bit about some of the reasoning why we saw what we saw. And TrekCore, I believe, has a piece up right now with some more information about the evolution. But when you saw the Discovery in that teaser trailer, what was your first impression of it?
I thought Klingons, and I thought Ralph McQuarrie. That's the two things I thought of. It looks like the Ralph McQuarrie design from the Clash of the Titans proposed movie in the 70s, but also from certain angles, it looks like a Klingon bird of prey. I mean, it has that kind of
or a D7 is what it looks a lot like.
Right, a D7,
like
exactly.
A battle cruiser, yeah.
Right, so, and then my head starts swimming with the whole idea of like, oh, well, maybe there's, this is a a cross between Starfleet and the Klingons, and they're on some joint mission, or maybe there's a Klingon battle and they've taken some Klingon technology so you can meet and compete against them one-on-one.
Or maybe at this point the Federation was part of the technology exchange program that the Klingons and the Romulans had going on.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's so many things like that you play with it. The more I think about it now, I don't know. I don't think that's what it is. I think the main thing is that they need a ship that looks different from the other ships in other series. You can't have these ships look too close together. They have to stand apart from each other. I mean, look at Voyager compared to the Enterprise D, and the D compared to the A in the original Enterprise, and even the XO1.
Defiant.
Right, and the Defiant, especially. I mean, all these things, and even the DS9 space station is different from others, from space stations we saw in the movies at that time. But I'd like to see it refined just a little. I'd like to see them keep working at it and developing it. It looks a little clunky in some respects, but I think it's going to grow on me over time. It's just getting used to it because we're so used to certain ways starships look. It took me a little while to get used to NX-01 when that came out too.
Yeah, which has turned out to be one of my favorite ships, actually.
Yeah. I
really love the design of the NX-01. What about the point of view? This could be interesting because, again, you co-host Literary Treks, so you're accustomed to Star Trek stories where they have a bit more room to tell the story through the format of a novel. We're going to have a lead character who's a woman who is not the captain. She is a lieutenant commander, as I understand it, and she's the lead. So I believe there will be a captain who we will see, and there will be interaction with the captain, but the story is not being told in the traditional format of captain down, with the captain being the lead. How do you feel about having someone further down in the crew being the primary point of view, being the lead for us in the stories?
I'm really excited about this because years ago, I thought, if they made another Star Trek series, how would I do it? And I remember sitting there thinking, okay, well, would I do a ship or a starbase? And, what kind of captain would I? And I kept thinking, it's got to be something different. It can't play exactly like the others. And this was one of my ideas. I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if why does the lead have to be the captain? The lead doesn't have to be a captain. I mean, you can even look at the movie Titanic, which is a ship, and the lead characters in that isn't the captain of the Titanic. So why not see a different perspective of the ship? And I think the captain of this ship will still be a primary character, a major character in the story, but maybe not the lead character of this. So the fact that this is 13 episodes, it's very episodic, that kind of tells one story throughout the way the season's going to play out. You almost have to think of it as being like a mini arc, like we've seen even in Star Trek Enterprise, where there was 3 episode arcs, and we saw the Xindi arc, and we saw...
Or like the end of Deep Space Nine, where you have 10 episodes, which essentially is one long story, right?
Right. So picture an episode turned into an arc, played over a long period of time. We've had episodes in all of these series that did not necessarily always focus on the captain. It was maybe one of the other characters was the lead in that episode. We'll take that episode and play it out into some epic, long 13-episode arc, and it would work. It's the same thing. I'm looking at this as, well, we've got the crew of the Discovery, and this story, which takes across 13 episodes, is the central character is this lieutenant commander. And I think it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting as well. And it could actually potentially give the entire cast more of an opportunity to be part of the story, because you don't have that lead traditional. Well, the captain, the first officer, and one other person has to get the bulk of the stories, and everyone else is pushed to the background. This could be a bit more of an ensemble cast as well.
Well, also consider the fact that the captain and the first officer could be captured in the very first episode, and that's why the lieutenant commander is the lead of this episode, because the captain and the first officer aren't available.
Yeah, could be. It's a good point. The other thing to talk about related to Discovery here is crew diversity. We've heard that we're going to of course, have a female lead. We're going to have a woman of color. We're going to have a gay character. We're going to have more aliens than we're accustomed to. It seems like we're going to have a very diverse crew. It made me think a little bit of Riker's ship, the Titan, in the novels, where he has a very diverse crew. What do you think about this, other than the obvious that it's about time and it mirrors society today, where diversity is certainly a very important topic?
Well, and that's what Gene tried to accomplish in the very first Star Trek series. The bridge of the ship should look like the planet. So this has to be a representation of what our planet looks like in diversity and what the universe looks like, including aliens. So it's right to have a diverse crew. I expect to see that. So a gay character, women, different colors, different races, whatever. I mean, that's what I want to see on the bridge of a ship. Now, here's where I have a little bit, just a little bit of a problem with this in this series is in the timeline. Because in my mind, when you look at these different series, the bridge crews in the 22nd, 23rd centuries are primarily human. And to me, it didn't involve until more of the 24th century that we start to see more and more aliens on a bridge of a starship. So it's kind of odd to me now that if we see a lot of aliens on this ship, that doesn't quite fit in with what we've seen on other ships of this time frame. Mm-hmm. But again, keeping an open mind, and I can work it in my headcanon that, well, this was a ship for some reason different from other ships and maybe has a different type of mission, and it was able to recruit a lot of different crew members from different planets. But I'm very happy to hear that we're going to have a diverse crew. We need a lot of diversity in a lot of the other shows too, and thank goodness Star Trek is doing that.
Yeah. I think that's where you have to, as I was saying a moment ago, as the viewer, you have to be open-minded and be flexible in your interpretation of the Star Trek timeline and the canon, because if society had been different in the 1960s, the makeup of bridge crews on the Enterprise and other ships would have probably been different as well. And there are certainly comments made in the original series about women can't be captains, but then in Enterprise we know that the captain of the Columbia, Captain Hernandez, was a woman. And I've always dismissed that line in the original series in the first place because it would make no sense to me through an evolution of our society that you would have only male captains, even in the 22nd or 23rd century. So for my headcanon, there were always women captains in the first place.
Absolutely.
As far as aliens, that one's hard because we've also had it established through novels anyway that during the founding of the Federation, you did have ships where it was more, these were human crews, these were Vulcan crews, these were Andorian crews and Tellarite crews. And so this show may go against that a little bit in the name of diversity. And to me, both are valid because I can see how ships of that time period would be crewed primarily by people from the planet from which they originate. That seems sort of natural as well. At the same time, I do kind of think that there is a good possibility that they would have mingled a bit more in reality if societies are advanced enough that they're out there in space and they're encountering one another. If they're that open-minded, they probably would have integrated themselves more quickly than what is suggested in some stories that we've read from that time period. So you just have to kind of go with the creative flow, be open-minded about it.
And it could be similar to what's in the novels in the 24th century with the Titan, as you mentioned earlier, because the Titan does have a highly diverse species of crew members, and more so than any other ship in Starfleet at that time period. So it could be the same within the 23rd century, where this one has a lot of different alien races represented, more so than other ships in the Federation for whatever reason.
Yeah, that would make a lot of sense too. All right, so that's Star Trek Discovery news, and now we'll wait until we get more details from Brian Fuller and the writing staff. The other thing I wanted to talk about in news today, Bruce, is the DS9 documentary that Ira Steven Behr says is in the works. He revealed this at Star Trek Las Vegas, and he said that he's been working on it for a number of years now, and it's in editing. He mentioned that he hopes that it would be released next month, meaning September. This is what he told Trek Movie in a video interview that they did. But he knows that that's not going to happen, and now he's hoping that it'll come out in 2017. Now, as a Niner, as the co-host of our Deep Space Nine show, The Orb, which I co-host with your Literary Treks co-host, Matthew Rushing, I'm really, really excited about this. How do you feel?
Oh, yeah, I'm really excited about this. This is long overdue, and I really wish we did get that this year for the 50th anniversary, but you know what? I don't want everything to come out on the 50th anniversary and things to go quiet the year after.
And so we'll have nothing next year except one TV show.
Right, exactly. So we get a new TV show, and then we get this documentary. Yeah, that just keeps the fuel going, So I'm very excited to see some behind the scenes look at DS9 that we're not familiar with and hear people's stories of what it was like to make the show. And then they're also talking about they come together to put together a first episode of an 8th season and what they possibly could have done. I think it's going to be, they're going to approach that with more of a fun aspect, maybe not as serious, but that'll be interesting to hear what they have to come up with.
I have long wanted to see all the writers from Deep Space Nine sit down together and really talk about what was going through their minds at the time and the process and the goals, because Star Trek always has great writing staffs, but there was something really unique about the combination of Ira Steven Behr and Ronald D. Moore and everyone who was working on this show, and the way they were able to incorporate religion into Star Trek, for example, which was something that no one was doing before and hasn't done since, and to make it fit together with the atheistic view of the Federation was really fascinating to me. The way that they were able to foresee a lot of issues that are hugely important to us in today's world. I didn't even bother reading this article. I didn't have time, but I saw someone posted in the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook, a post by a fairly large publication, I think it was, saying that it's really hard to take Deep Space Nine seriously today, that the more years that go by, the harder it is to take DS9 seriously. I don't know how you can watch Deep Space Nine today and say that. I really don't understand, because of all the stories in Star Trek, none are more applicable, none have stood the test of time better, in my opinion, than Deep Space Nine. We're seeing so many things that were addressed in that series becoming the hot button issues of today. And I have always wanted to see the writers sit down and really explain their thought process.
That's a really odd comment that this person would make, because I would say out of all of the 5 live action series, see how I did that? 5 live action? I know there's a 6, but it's animated. Of the 5
live in there.
Of the 5 live action series, if I would choose of the 5, which series do I see would more likely be made today, it would be Deep Space Nine. I mean,
definitely.
Just in the style of the show and the issues that it's addressing, and it's more episodic, just like most of series are today on TV. If anything, it's easier to watch nowadays than I would think of some of the other shows. So, yeah, I don't get that.
I don't understand the headline either. And maybe it was just clickbait, but I don't know how. I'll probably go and actually read through it. Often when I see things like that, I do take them as clickbait. And because the basic premise they're working from isn't logical at all, I just move along home, I guess you would say.
Well, now that one won't work today.
But that episode works really well as an original series episode, which we covered it as on the Orb a long time ago.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm really excited. Ira said that he he didn't get all the writers back together because it was a massive undertaking to try to do that, but he got back the core group. He also got a lot of the actors. I was really sad to hear that he was not able to get Avery Brooks to be part of the documentary, and I don't know why. He said in the Trek movie interview that he talked to Avery Brooks on the phone many, many times, but he just wasn't able to get him to actually come get on camera and be part of the documentary. And given that he was the lead of the show, given that I've come to see him as one of the great captains, it's hard for me to say who's my favorite captain or which captain I think is best, because there are different aspects of each captain where I think that they brought the best to Star Trek. So there are areas where Kirk is my favorite, areas where Picard is my favorite, areas where Sisko is. But when I watch Deep Space Nine today, I appreciate more and more every time what Avery Brooks brought to the franchise and what he brought to that role. And I really, really wish that he were going to be part of this documentary. But I'm glad that we're at least going to get to hear from a lot of the other actors.
It would be great to see Avery Brooks in this. And maybe he didn't come on because they couldn't guarantee him a piano to sit at and play.
That's probably it, right? Yeah, this is not a musical. It's documentary, Avery. Well, I don't think I can do it then, man. You know, give me a piano and I'll be there.
Yeah. But unfortunately, no piano, no Avery. But I think it sounds to me this is more from a writer's angle. Maybe I'm misunderstanding, but I'm fine with it if it's all just the writers and the creative process behind writing the series. So, you know, if the actors can't be there, that's fine. I mean, just give me the inside look at the writers, because a lot of these actors, I know their experience on the show because I've seen them at conventions and other documentaries. So I'm not really going to miss the, Avery Brooks that much from this. I'm more interested to hear what these writers have to say.
Yeah. Except if you get them all together, you get that family element that maybe you've seen on stage at cons, but a lot of us haven't been able to see. I think it's largely from the writer's perspective, but again, in this interview, Ira does mention that the writers reveal a lot of stuff that really moved him emotionally, and some of it to the point where they're not sure if they'll be able to even include it in the documentary. So that's kind of fascinating to me. But we'll wait and we'll see when it comes out. Again, they're hoping 2017. I can't wait. I do hope that when it does come out that it's easily available internationally, because in the past when these things have come out, it's been difficult for me to see them until long after they have been released. But the way that CBS handled Discovery gives me hope, although I don't know if this is going to be an official documentary or not, because Ira did also mention that now that the Spock documentary, which was Adam Nimoy's project, which has nothing to do with CBS, is now done, now they're going to move on to DS9. And I didn't quite understand if that meant that some of the same people are working on both, or if it was just, let's make sure that Leonard Nimoy has his spotlight without any interference, and now let's move on to the next thing. But we'll see. All right, well, that is all that we have in the news. We're going to jump into the feature here. But before we do that, I'd like to share with you some of the other things that we've been talking about here on the network. So here's a quick look at some of our other shows.
Previously on Trek.fm, The Ready Room.
I like the way that they were able to weave, she says you can't allow the concern for a single crewman to affect the mission. And that's actually one of the deeper, richer moments in this episode. In fact, it's probably the only really deep, rich moment in the episode.
Right.
The 602 Club.
It is time for us to explore Superman and the questions about him in a new and different way in the context of the world in which we live. And that's what Snyder is doing. People just don't like it because, you know what? Superman hasn't changed, but the world in which Superman's trying to serve has.
Meta Treks.
The only thing it was missing was a Geordi PowerPoint.
Yeah, about the closest thing we have to a Geordi PowerPoint in Star Trek Beyond, Mike, is Spock trying to point out the location of Uhura's radioactive tracking device necklace.
He gave her a radio tracking device necklace.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
So check out all of these shows and find out what we're talking about in your favorite corner of the Star Trek universe. You can find us everywhere you get your podcasts. The easiest place is really iTunes because we're a featured content provider with Apple, and we have an artist section there in the iTunes store. Just go to itunes.com/trekfm. That's itunes.com/trekfm, and it'll take you straight over there. If you're an Android user, you can find us in Google Play Music. Just look us up in your Google Play Music app, and you'll find most of our shows. You can also find us pretty much everywhere else that you get podcasts. Also, just search for Trek.fm or the name of the show, and you'll probably find us there. All right, well, Bruce, let's bring in Luke and talk about justice.
Do you notice something different? Look at all the mountain flowers. They are spelling out a message, but are too far away to read. Yeah. I know.
When looking for a stopover for shore leave, perhaps Commander Riker is not the best person to allow to choose the planet. But that's what he did in the episode Justice, and today we're going to discuss this fun, yet also serious episode from The Next Generation's first season. And to help us do that, we are joined for the first time ever on the Ready Room by a new member of the Trek FM crew, Luke Weir. Luke, welcome.
Hello, it's great to be here.
It's great to have you here in the Ready Room for the first time. And as I mentioned, you're a new crew member of Trek FM, and we'll tell everyone about that at the end of the discussion, because right now we're too busy running around everywhere to stop and talk about that. So this is an episode I've been wanting to talk about for a long time, but we've never worked it into the Ready Room rotation because I'm not sure people think that it's a very good episode, but we'll find out today what we think about the message. Luke, why don't you kick us off with your initial thoughts?
All right. Well, to give a little bit of context to this, I'm actually working on my Star Trek, well, not a rewatch. It'd be my first time through. I'm wanting to get through every episode of every series, and I'm still kind of stuck in the original series. It's been there's times some of the episodes are really great, some of them it's tough sometimes. So I kind of skipped ahead to The Next Generation since this episode is so early in the first season. So I went ahead and binged the first 10 episodes or so of The Next Generation, and I was worried going into this one. I was worried this might be the first stinker, but I don't think it is. I don't think it's bad. I just think it's very, I don't know, it has a very specific aesthetic that doesn't necessarily translate well, especially when you have to figure out how to stuff it into the network TV landscape with those limitations. So yeah, it's hard to say. Kind of, I wouldn't want to say this is an okay or decent episode even, but it's not quite. It's not quite bad. It's not quite bad. It's just, yeah.
Okay, well, we'll see if that view changes for better or worse as we go on today. How about you, Bruce? What are your initial thoughts?
Well, when you told me which episode we were going to talk about, I had to look. I'm like, now wait, which one's Justice? And I look up, and the first thing I see is season 1. I was like, oh gosh, okay, it's going to be a season 1 episode. And then when I saw which one it was, I was like, oh yeah, this one's going to be fun. I'm glad it's this one. Because
I should have told it to you by its original title, Running in Shorts.
That would have thrown me off just a little bit. Or running in diapers, because there's times I think it looks like they're wearing diapers.
Yeah.
So that is very true.
Yeah, I don't remember what I originally thought of this episode the first time I saw it back in 1987 or 88, whichever year it was that it came out. So 87. Yeah. I don't remember what I thought then, but I know what I think now. And actually, I'll save it for later, but I was coming in with low expectations to rewatch this again.
All right. Well, I watched it yesterday for the first time in a long time, and I always remember it for the crazy outfits that the Ida wear and the fact that they're very overly amorous. But I had forgotten just how funny it is, or maybe I wasn't paying that close attention the first time that not the first time I watched it because I've seen it many times, but back when it first aired and then when I've watched it over the years since then. Today, and maybe it's because of some of the dialogue in society these days about what's appropriate or inappropriate to show or talk about, I'm very surprised that in 1987, this episode came on television with people dressed this way, with people making out all over the place. They make love at the drop of a hat. There's a scene where they walk into the room where everyone is, and there are two people laying on top of each other on a table or a sofa.
Yeah.
In the background, it's really wild. And then there are some wonderful lines of dialogue in here that I did not remember. Like when the Edo who greet them take the crew back to meet the other Edo, and they arrive, Riven comes up and hugs Riker, and she says, "Oh, I thought you would be out of breath." And Riker says, "I may surprise you in many ways." And I'm like, really? That line is in this episode?
Yeah.
Oh, I was just cracking up. And then eventually the episode turns very serious. And that's something that I also want to talk about today. We're going to joke around quite a bit, I'm sure, but then we're going to talk about the serious elements. And I do wonder if in the end, the writers undermined themselves and undermined their message by setting the story on this odd planet where people are so overly sexual that it's sort of, I don't know, something about the nature of the society paired with the absolute laws and single punishment just doesn't quite mesh together for me. But again, well,
yeah, it definitely feels like two interesting ideas kind of mashed together because they weren't able to fill either of them out. So I wonder if that might have happened with this episode.
Well, interestingly, this episode was the second episode written. It was the first episode written after Encounter at Farpoint, even though it was the 8th episode produced and the 7th released. And the reason that it wasn't produced or released for a while is because they had to keep rewriting the story.
Okay.
And we'll talk a little bit about the original towards the end of the show today, but it does seem like maybe they were more on the right track originally, and for various reasons, they ended up going down this kind of a unusual path. So we'll talk about that.
Yeah, it's strange that this story is about this society that's very sexual, but that really doesn't have anything to do with the message of the story about the laws and it being protected by this entity. And it's like, it is almost like they sat in the writer's room and said, well, it can't just be just a regular planet that's like our Earth. So how do we make them different? Do we make them people who eat a lot or drink a lot? Or, hey, what about they just have, flirtation? I'll leave it at that. Flirtation a lot.
You can say it, Bruce. They have sex a lot. That's what they do.
I never saw that in the
Rubicun III.
episode, Chris. They do not show people having sex. They're just,
I don't know. I was a little worried at a couple of points. I was looking at my screen, looking in the background. I was a little bit worried.
But it's certainly what they imply, because when they're on the bridge of the Enterprise before they beam down, Geordi says they make love at the drop of a hat, and Yar says, any hat.
That was a pretty great line. There's a lot of weird lines in this episode, but that was a pretty great line.
Another thing I like about this episode is how they can't just say Wesley. Everyone says the boy, Wesley Crusher.
I was trying to figure out why they're still doing that in, I guess it's only episode 7, so not that far along, but I don't know if they thought that people were going to get the doctor and the boy confused. I don't.
Yeah, that's right. Don't confuse the Crushers. There's the doctor and there's the boy.
Yeah.
It could be a remnant of the rewrites, but since this was the first episode written after the pilot, it could be that was written in, and they kept messing around with other elements of the story, but they never actually went and adjusted that because they weren't really calling him the boy anymore. I don't think they were anyway.
Well, it could be that
so
people
often at that point.
People aren't that familiar with the characters at this point. It's a brand new series, so if they say, "Oh, we need to go find Wesley," maybe they're afraid people are going to think, now who's Wesley again? Is it the guy with the visor? Is it, the clip? So maybe it's like, we need to go find the boy. Or, well, I think they actually do say Wesley in that line, but, Picard always refers to him as, get the boy off the bridge.
Yeah, and that is one of the things with this type of show where everybody's being referred to by their rank. So it's easier to establish those people, but then when you have these named characters on the side, that could be more difficult to get them established.
But by that logic, on the planet, we should have heard a line where Yar says something to Riker like, I think we should contact the bald man, Captain Picard.
Oh, that would have been funny.
Or contact that guy who's got his leg up on that table over there.
That's right. Mr. Proppy. That's him. All right. So what do you guys think about the story and whether it would make it on television today or maybe even a decade ago? When Enterprise aired, people were all up in arms about how racy the show was and how they had the decon chamber scenes and they were showing them rubbing oil on their bodies. And then later on, we got a few scenes like we see Jolene's bare back and maybe you can kind of see the sides of her breasts just a little bit when she and Trip are doing the massage therapy. And that stuff, I feel like for television today, that stuff in particular that Enterprise was doing is not unusual at all, and I didn't really find it to be that odd at the time. But a lot of people felt it was very inappropriate for Star Trek. And when I heard those things, I would always think back to this particular episode in 1987 on The Next Generation and how sexualized these aliens are and how much skin they show and how flirtatious and sexual the actions are, and even the dialogue, like I just mentioned, the dialogue from Riker, suggesting that he might have intimate relations with Riven later. Do you think that this episode could come on television today as part of Star Trek without upsetting people? What do you think, Bruce?
I don't think this episode would be produced the way it was. I don't think today they would produce it the same way. I think they would still do something like this. It would just play out differently. It would probably be maybe not as cheesy is the right word. I don't know. But I think it could be more sexual in the way that Enterprise was, as you were mentioning. I think audiences are more accepting if a different society may be over sexual versus how we saw the NX-01 crew when they played up their sexuality on there. I think people had more problems with it was the crew that they were trying to make sexy as opposed to a different race, a different planet having advanced sexual expressions and outward feelings for one another. It kind of reminds me in a lot of ways of the Deltans. We've never really gotten a good portrayal of the Deltans, and I'd like to see something with them in this kind of context where visiting their planet might be interesting too.
And for those who aren't familiar with the Deltans, that's Ilea from the motion picture, and they have to take an oath of celibacy when they join Starfleet because their society is just so over-sexualized. Yeah. What about you, Luke?
Yeah, there's definitely some things that would have to be adjusted for if this episode is going to be produced and aired today. I keep going back to the costumes. I'm not sure. I have no idea how they would handle the costumes now because they're so cheesy, and I'll go as far as say they're just awful. But in thinking like practically with those costumes, as a society, if that's just the standard dress for everyone, at some point, I feel like, it's so inefficient. There's these tiny strips of cloth, just barely, and you're not protected from any of the elements. I don't know. We didn't really see what the weather was like there if they had bad weather, but at some point, is it even worth it anymore? Are you even going to bother putting on these tiny little strips of cloth? So I guess obviously from network standards and practices point, they can't really go down that road. But from an in-universe standpoint, I don't even know what the point of those outfits are.
I'm picturing in the summer there, it must be really tough because imagine the marks you would have from your suntan.
Yeah.
Right?
They must get a lot of sunscreen. They have to put a lot of that on. But it's funny too, because as silly as we think the costumes are, if you were going to visit another planet, I'm sure people are going to dress so differently from us that sometimes it's going to look odd and sometimes it would look silly. So they could probably be looking at the uniforms of the Enterprise crew members and thinking how silly they look. They're wearing different colors and their whole bodies are covered. It's like, what? That looks so uncomfortable. Why would you even dress that way? How silly that looks. So it's from their different perspectives.
I think that Ito would say, your clothes are so impractical. It takes so long to get those off.
Yeah.
Oh, I wonder. I was looking through my notes here. There was a lot of interesting quotes. I was trying to just sort of make an outline of what happens with the episodes to give these quotes context. But I was thinking of when they first beamed down to the planet and the Ito's greetings for them. I think that would cause some problems right away, just because we're much more culturally. I think consent is much more of a important topic now, and I could definitely see some people, especially with the internet now, there would be some people who would not be cool with those greetings.
But some people like Worf like it.
Yeah,
nice planet.
Yeah. Well, that Worf was another thing. She kept referring to him as the huge one. Yes. And that's with I don't even want to go down that route, but I do not think that would fly today.
Luke, what did she mean by that?
Yeah,
you can read a lot into that, Bruce.
at its worst, there'd be backlash. At best, that would be memed to death, and that would not be a good thing for.
Oh, Star it would be memed to death.
It would be.
Yeah. So we joke, but it is interesting to think about how these things would be perceived today, because you can watch it today and you can remember, well, okay, it was written in 1987. That's fine. But if it were written for the first time today, what would people think about it? I thought the crew reactions were interesting to those greetings as well. Like Worf looked a little uncomfortable, but I think he was cool with it.
He warmed up to it.
Riker was very excited. Yar seemed very excited. And Troy was obviously very uncomfortable. And Troy is the one person amongst the group who can actually read the feelings and emotions of the Ito. So she knew exactly what that guy was thinking while he was hugging her.
Yeah, I love that she just kind of tapped his shoulder while looking off into the distance. That's just very polite, but
she's
clearly
like,
very uncomfortable.
This is nice. Can we go meet your other people now?
And not only is she sensing what they're thinking, but she's also sensing what her own crew members are thinking at the time, which may be even more uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And especially her Imzadi. Yes.
Yes.
Speaking of Troy, I love the opening of the episode when they're on the bridge and Troy is telling Picard that Will is so excited about this planet. And then Riker comes in and he has this gigantic grin on his face, and Picard's asking him, so you can't find anything wrong with this planet? And Riker says, nope, it's perfect. I love this place. This is the perfect place. That's not verbatim dialogue, by the way. That's my interpretation of the dialogue.
Yeah. Yeah, well, looking at those early scenes, there's a few lines there that were just foreshadowing to a ridiculous level. They were describing the planet, and Dr. Crusher says, oh, this sounds wonderful for the children. And right. That does not pan out. Also, Picard says something about, oh, I hope it's not too good to be true. And, we all know where that's going.
This would have been even better if when Riker came back from the planet, he was dressed like the people on the planet and walks on the bridge that way saying, oh, this planet is perfect. And Picard is like, no, number one, we're leaving. Engage.
Imagine if everyone on the bridge was dressed that way except for Picard, and then he felt very uncomfortable. He's like, we're getting out of here.
Oh, that's one thing. When you're talking about the greetings of the crew, Picard eventually beams down to the planet, and I was disappointed that he wasn't warmly greeted that same way, because he would have felt very uncomfortable, and that would have been a funny scene.
Yeah. But by that point, they already knew that he was coming there to probably take away the boy, Wesley Crusher, in violation of their laws, and so they were not particularly happy to see him.
That's true.
All right. So let's talk a little bit more about the rules, I think. I was going to talk about the customs, but we've really probably touched on most of that. I guess a few other things about the customs, though. Do you think a society like this could actually function? I mean, thinking back to an episode from the original series, this reminds me a little bit of is The Apple, where you have this very naive, almost like a childlike society. It's also sort of a Garden of Eden setting.
Yeah.
Except these people are like the end of the apple moving forward after they learn that, oh, well, it's okay to have this physical contact. What would happen to them from that point? But did you get that feeling at all? And does this remind you of any other stories from Star Trek that have this Garden of Eden paradise type feel to it?
Well, sort of along the lines of the Garden of Eden. Hold on. Nope. I just totally lost that thought. I guess I was sort of thinking more along the lines of the Shore Leave episodes. Sorry, I'm not exactly playing into your question very well. But Shore Leave episodes, it's always a paradise. It always seems like just the most perfect place. And have we ever had a Shore Leave episode where everything just goes great? Where nothing happened, nothing goes wrong, nobody gets captured or almost killed?
Tied up in a basement?
Yeah.
Like happened to Trill and Malcolm.
Same with the really idyllic planets that they visit. There's always, I don't think they ever actually just visit a nice planet and then leave.
Right.
There's no nice planets in the Star Trek universe.
Except for Ryza, because that's what this one reminded me of. This planet, I thought, could this be Ryza? And I thought about Deep Space Nine and the Next Generation dealing with the planet Ryza. But yeah, that's the only thing this one really reminded me of, based on the type of planet this is and how sexual they are. It reminded me of Ryza, and like I said, it would remind me of something that I think we would see from the Deltans.
Yeah, except with Ryza, like Luke is saying, something still tends to go wrong. So Picard goes to Ryza, and he gets caught up in this whole search for an artifact, and then DS9, they go to Ryza, and Worf gets caught up in this whole political protest about the weather grid, and then the NX-01 goes to Ryza, and Hoshi is the only person who has a good time, and everyone else gets injured or robbed or tied up, or
and then they sort of try to do a similar sort of Ryza thing in Voyager. I don't remember the name of the planet, but it's fairly early on, I think, in season 1, where they visit this planet where everything's great. And of course, there may be a way for them to get home. It's the one with the guy who says, that is not at all pleasurable.
And that's with Mr. Pecan Pie, right?
I think so. We'd have to go back and...
But Harry falls in love with this girl, right? And she shows him how to jump through. Yeah, exactly. There's always something like that. Well, let's talk about the laws a little bit, which I call rules temporarily, because when they get down there, first of all, Yar is really, really bad at screening planets, because Picard asks her, is there anything about their laws that we should be concerned about? It's nothing. It's just the usual. Nothing really to be concerned about. It's just common sense stuff. And then we get down there, and the boy, Wesley Crusher, is almost sentenced to death. But the scene where that happens, where he falls into the flower bed, 3 different explanations are given as to why he has done something wrong. So the ball is thrown, and he's running, and he jumps to catch it, and he falls into the flower bed, and then the other boy, the Edo boy, comes up and says, "Hey, didn't you see the little white fence? You can't go across the white fence." Okay, so there's the first reason. Don't go across the white fence. So as the viewer, you're thinking areas that are marked off by white fences are out of bounds. You can't go there.
Right.
Then they say it's illegal to hurt young flowers. So that's the second reason. Don't hurt young flowers. So you're thinking, as long as I don't hurt young flowers on Rubicon 3, I'll be okay. And then the enforcers come over, and they say that this zone has been selected. So now you're thinking that certain areas of the planet are selected as enforcement zones, and if you do something in those areas, then you get punished. But maybe if these flowers had been in a zone that was not selected, you would not be punished for falling into the flower bed. So that's the third reason that's given. But then there's one more thing that happens. When Riker and Yar and Worf come over and they take the syringe away from the enforcers, then the enforcers tell them that if this zone were still selected, you would also deserve death for your actions. So now you're thinking, well, this zone is not selected anymore. So 5 minutes ago, this zone was selected, and now it's not selected. So how does that work?
That was crazy. I mean, you think, we don't see any computer systems here on this planet. They don't seem quite advanced enough for that. So how on earth they choose these areas where the rules are enforced and how they switch is just, I don't think there's any way you can really justify that.
I don't know. I mean, we didn't see how they choose these zones, and maybe there is some sophisticated computer system, but the zones are chosen randomly throughout the day, obviously very quickly too. So if Wesley had fallen into the flowers and that zone wasn't the zone that was selected at that time, he would have been fine. He would not have gotten in trouble. It just so happens, coincidence, that zone was selected at the time he fell into the flowers. And as soon as he gets out of the flowers, that zone has moved somewhere else. They moved to another zone. And so the violation of the Enterprise crew, well, it can't be enforced. They're not going to be executed because the zone has moved. The zone has not been selected. It's kind of strange, but they explained earlier that random zone choosing, you never know when the zone is chosen, so you always have to behave. You cannot break the law because you never know. If you do break the law, if you break the rules, it may be in the zone that was selected and you could be executed. So you always have to be on your best behavior.
So the boy is unlucky, Bruce, is what you're saying.
The boy is unlucky. He's been unlucky all his life. And in this case, he was unlucky when we saw those two enforcers running after him. But, he was also kind of a jerk. Wesley, the boy was, I'm sorry.
He was, yeah.
Because he falls
in the boy, not the doctor. Okay.
The jerk boy fell into the flowers.
Jerk boy.
And then they come over and they're like, oh my gosh, Wesley, no, you weren't supposed to fall. He goes, oh, don't worry about it. I'm okay. I'm not hurt. It's like, do you think you should apologize for ruining the flowers and the flower contraption that they were in? But no, don't worry about that. I'm fine. So let's move on. It's like, no, you should apologize.
Yeah, that definitely stuck out to me. He just did not even care.
Well, he did later say, I'm sorry, though.
Well,
but just not right on the spot. It was later, after he knew he was going to die for it.
Yeah, we're going to kill you. Oh, okay. Well, then I am sorry.
Yeah. But getting back to those zones for a little bit, I mean, they have to organize these zones somehow. Whether they have advanced technology to do that, or if it's just some guy looking at a map, randomly selecting areas in the map, which that could be very problematic too. But yeah, I mean, we didn't see at all how these areas get changed, or if these are, no matter how they're selected, this could be a really big problem if someone was able to figure out how to game the system, like either hacking into the computer and figuring out what zones are going to be death
that's
zones.
What Kirk would do. Kirk would reprogram the computer so that it was possible to damage flowers in the zone without being punished.
Yeah, and then even then, if it's just some guy with a map, I mean, that's so much power. You could just you could. I mean, there's so much room for just taking it out on someone, just getting revenge against your ex. Even that, there's so many different problems this could have.
So Larry Nemechek and I were talking about this and how these rules don't make much sense. And one thing that he suggested that could have made more sense from a story standpoint, although it differs from what you suggest, Bruce, so I'm going to come back to that, is that the Edo have some kind of implant or something that allows them to know when an area has been selected as a zone. And of course, visitors would not have that, and then they would have no way of knowing. And that, if you wanted to tell a story where the locals actually do know how the system works, then that could be a way to make sense of that story.
That's true. And if that had been used, that probably could have worked pretty well. One thing I did notice that they did react poorly when Wesley fell into the flower bed, but they didn't really have those extreme reactions. Like the girl, she says, "Oh no!" as soon as she sees the mediator starting to come. So that would imply that probably is not the case. But it probably would have worked better if they had implemented something like that.
But Bruce, what you said is also very interesting and probably does make more sense in that if you don't know which zone is going to be selected, then you have to be on your best behavior at all times because you never know. Now, I certainly would not want to live in a society like that. But from the point of view of the people who are trying to keep law and order, that would make sense.
I guess it's the same way with security systems here on our planet. You know, if you're going to go and rob a house, you're questioning, well, I don't know. Are the people there? Do they have a security system? You start to hesitate and wonder if you should even actually go and break into that house. And footnote, I do not do that. I don't break into people's houses. So just so everybody knows, but you're going to question those things. You know, am I going to get in trouble? And I think that's what this episode's trying to say with these zones is that, you know, if no one knows if they're going to get in trouble or not, but there's the chance that they are, and the result is execution, then nobody's going to do anything. And they acted like this has been going on for a while, that they got rid of all the bad apples. And now they're only left with the ones that are afraid to do anything. So really we have a scared society. So no wonder they're loving on each other. They're trying to make each other feel better.
Exactly. That's true. It's like because making love is not illegal on Rubicun 3, and therefore you can do that in any zone, and they do that in any zone, and they have nothing to worry about.
Yeah, so, you know, and there again, the laws aren't clear because our rules would not fit into that. We're not making love anywhere we want to. That would be unacceptable. So the rules have to be clear to visitors coming to your planet, and that's where the Edo fail because they do not make the rules clear enough.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the thing. They have this line about how ignorance of the law cannot be allowed to be a defense. But they have a responsibility to explain. So maybe let's take some of our laws, for example. On the highway, don't drive faster than 65 miles per hour, or don't run stop signs. Don't drink alcohol if you're not over 21 in the United States. Okay, these laws are not really a big deal. So if you're visiting and you break that law, the worst thing that's going to happen is you're going to get a ticket. You're going to pay a fine for that. You're not going to be executed. Yeah, so the Edo have a responsibility to visitors. If the punishment for any digression is death, they have a responsibility up front to tell this to anyone visiting, and they don't do it. And because of that, the entire argument that's being made from the Edo side just falls flat for me because they failed in their first responsibility, which was to make sure that visitors to their planet know that if you do anything wrong here, you're going to be killed.
Yeah, and I think with pretty much any system, you can pretty much make any system work if you can get everyone on board. Any system can have internal consistency if you try hard enough and if you have the right people on board. If everybody agrees on the same thing, any system can work no matter how flawed it may appear from someone on the outside. So I feel like this could work for them. It seemed to have worked quite well for them, but yeah, they just never took into account the possibilities of someone else, an unknown variable coming into that system. So I think that's where it says the system starts to break down. And do we even see if these people have space travel? Are they traveling? I don't think they're traveling outside their planet, are they?
I don't think so, but that's a really good question because the Prime Directive comes into play here, right?
Yeah, so that was another problem for me. If they aren't traveling in space yet, then yeah, they wouldn't really have a reason to take these considerations into mind.
So before we talk about that, because that is another topic on our outline, let's pick up with what you were just saying about whether this system of law and order could work for their society. So you do feel, Luke, that a system of absolute law like this is workable. It could work for a society Do you think it's sustainable? Like, I can see a government wanting to implement this. I can see law enforcement wanting to implement this. But it's hard for me to see the citizens of a society accepting this and allowing it to become stable.
Yeah. Yeah, that's again where it just comes down to you have to have every single person on board. I mean, we saw a very small portion of this planet. We don't really know what other continents are like. We don't really know what their planet is like at all. So this could be a very specific area or a specific country where this is how they live, and that's just how their laws work. And then those who can't live within that system are forced out. So that's one way they could weed out the people who just would not work in that system.
That's the thing about Star Trek that I always wonder about is when they're visiting other planets. And Luke, you were mentioning maybe this is a different continent, country, or something. You know, how does the crew decide which continent, which country to visit on a planet? Because this society might not represent the whole planet. And maybe this is a society that maybe they were criminals and it's a penal colony and they establish these rules to create order. Now, I'm going to assume with this episode, this is to represent the entire planet. So, because we're not introduced that there are other societies and other countries that have different rules. But having the rules absolute is not practical. I think that there would be a revolt from the citizens of this planet to have such rules because mistakes are making. Accidents happen. I mean, we're talking about, you know, if I'm driving a car and I accidentally pull out into an intersection before it's my turn and fender bender, maybe it's just a light accident. It's just a, you know, I'm not going to be executed for that. I'm not, maybe there's a small fine or something to that effect, but it's an accident. I shouldn't be killed for an accident. And it wasn't Wesley purposely going to destroy the flowers. He fell into them. It was an accident. So just think there's other people on this planet that are going to fall into flowers or do other things like that. And what, they're being executed? I would think there would be a revolt of citizens coming out saying, look, the boy or whoever fell in the flowers by accident. Now we're executing yet another one of our citizens. We can't live like this anymore. And to me, that would be a more interesting story than what we got.
Yeah, well, maybe the people we see in this episode are the only people on the planet because they just keep messing up and they keep killing their own kind. And they have 20 people left.
They are all who are left, yeah. But yeah, that's my view of it. That let's just say you have a family, and the mother or the father is executed because they tripped and fell on a bee and killed a bee. Something like this, you know, it's some ridiculous thing that no one should ever be executed for, but they only have one punishment, which is death. After that happens a few times, I would expect the people to really revolt against this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the system would definitely not work on Earth in any scenario at all. That's why, I mean, that's part of what makes it so alien, is that this just could not work on Earth.
Well, what about rules in schools and rules in homes? I mean, people have to reflect what they do in home and is a reflection of how society is set up. I mean, in our own family, we have punishments when rules are broken, and we make judgments based on if the punishment is necessary or not, or how severe that punishment is. And that translates to everything we do in our own laws and societies. And so I don't think families, if their child just breaks a rule, how does a family on this planet handle that? They're not going to, of course, execute them for it. But then they're going to give them a punishment. But punishment is such an odd thing when it comes to society. There is no such thing as a fine or just a small punishment. There's an absolute. And I can't see any school or family functioning with absolute rules like that. It would be insane.
Uh-huh. There's a concept called the age of accountability that you find at least in Christianity. I don't know about other religions, but it's basically the idea that someone is de facto innocent up until a certain age, and then once they're old enough to understand the concepts of the religion, then they will be accountable for their actions in the afterlife. So it's something like that could have potentially explained away how families are able to survive in this society to a certain extent. But of course, we don't get to see anything like that. We don't get to see schools or places of work or anything like that, and that makes us wonder, like, where these syringes of poison come from? If everybody's just lounging around, looking into each other's eyes all day, and then some, then like, how does the society work?
But because Wesley is going to be executed and he's a boy, then the Ito children who he was playing with were all similar age, so they would have also been executed for a crime. Yeah. So if there is an age before which you're not executed because you're not yet able to be accountable for your actions, what would that age be? That's something that, we don't explore in this episode. And so it's an interesting idea, and I could certainly see that being the case, where maybe there is something along those lines, but it's another question that we don't get answered.
So many questions in this episode.
And that's what a good Star Trek episode does.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And it also shows that there's no room for forgiveness. And that's sad too, because even you're talking about religion there, Luke, and, even in Christian religion, they talk about, forgiveness. And that's something that the society doesn't have. They're not going to forgive you if you do something wrong. And it's just, the more we talk about this, the more insane it sounds to me.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, and this does seem to be more of a religion the farther along we get in this episode, with the introduction of the god or the gods, or however you want to say it. I wrote down, let's see, I wrote down what some of the mediators were saying towards the end when they're trying to beam out, and the gods are not letting them beam out. This one mediator sort of had this angry glee of sorts, and he's telling them that God has prevented your escape. And of course, Dr. Crusher says that, well, then if that's the case, then your God is unfair. We had no warning that this act was criminal. So yeah, I think there is a lot of connection to religion in this episode. There's a lot of allegory there, and that sort of does play into Gene Roddenberry's issues with religion.
Yeah, very much so. But before we touch on that, I do want to just say that where we're coming down in terms of the Ito judicial system is the message of the episode, because that's what Picard finally says, and that's how he's able to beam up at the end, is that he convinces very quickly the Ito gods or God that there can be no justice so long as laws are absolute. And as we've discussed here, you do have to have some sort of flexibility. You have to put crimes, not even crimes, but just actions into context. And you have to have punishments that fit the crime. I mean, that's what people always say. Sounds cliche, but it's true. The God thing is a recurring idea for Gene Roddenberry. It's something that he was almost obsessed with. You see it throughout the original series. His original idea for what became the motion picture was called the God thing. It dealt with that, and we again see it many times in The Next Generation. In fact, in this episode, he brings Riven up to the ship. He shows her the spaceship through the windows of the Enterprise, and she bows down. It's very similar to what he does in the episode First Contact, where he takes the minister up there, the scientist up there to the ship. And then, of course, he shows Lily Earth in the movie First Contact, and not from orbit, but this reminds me a bit of Who Watches the Watchers again, where you have, because in this episode, Riven thinks that Picard is a god when they beam down towards the end, and she bows down to him, just like we saw with the Mintakans in Who Watches the Watchers. So there is this recurring theme here. Before we talk about the nature of the gods themselves in this episode, do you feel like, Bruce, that this is a well that's dipped into too frequently in Star Trek, especially in the earlier years when Gene was more involved?
Maybe a little. At this time of this episode, maybe not as much, but as we've gone along, we've seen even more and more of this. I don't know if even though this thing, I'm just going to call it a thing right now, this thing that's out in space is considered a god, I didn't feel like the god position was played up that much from the society. I don't think that the society, as we were seeing on the planet, we weren't seeing them really doing any worshiping. We didn't see them really referring to the god. They didn't base their society on the god. It was something that was later brought up. Once Picard brought up Ribbon to the ship, that's when she bowed down to the god. And it was interesting, too, that she said she had seen this before. And I'm not sure how she saw this thing before, because it's in space and they apparently haven't been in space. I don't know. It doesn't appear that they have been. But I didn't feel like this relied so much on the god thing as much as some other episodes. So it didn't feel overplayed to me.
As far as how she could have seen it before, this episode reminds me a bit of the wonderful Voyager episode, Blink of an Eye, where the people on that planet think that Voyager is a god. There's this ship up there, and because of the fact that time passes at a different rate for them, it had been up there for centuries and centuries, even though it was just hours, I think, or days for the Voyager crew. But they eventually developed the ability to actually see it through a telescope. So it could have been something like that. Yeah. But this episode does remind me of that a little bit. So as for the ship itself being a god, that was also another case in Star Trek where you have some alien race overseeing and protecting. This reminded me a little bit of the prophets in Deep Space Nine who are protecting the Bajorans. We don't know why they're protecting the Bajorans. And here we don't know why these aliens are protecting the Edo. There's a little bit of an implication in this episode, at least I thought of this, that maybe these aliens refer to the Edo as their children. And I did kind of wonder if they actually created the Edo. Because there's this whole explanation about how they once existed in humanoid form just as we did, and they evolved, and now they exist. And the impression I got was multiple dimensions. And so that this ship, because it was transparent at times or translucent, that it's existing in different dimensions at once and you can only see part of it. And if they had evolved to be that advanced, had they tried to create life on their own and they actually put the Edo on this planet and were therefore protecting them?
Yeah, that sounds like a definite possibility. I can't remember if it was Picard or Data who was suggesting that possibility of them actually being direct descendants or somehow the children of these multidimensional beings. Part of that is also, I think, just playing into the religious concept, referring to the gods, referring to them as their children, like protecting their children. So
that's definitely on the surface level.
Yeah.
That's the reading, right? Yeah. But I do wonder on a deeper level if maybe, because I'm thinking, when I see stories like this, I'm thinking about what are the motivations of the aliens to protect these people. It's like on Voyager, you have the caretaker who's protecting the Ocampa, but of course we know why the caretaker is protecting the Ocampa. It's because he feels guilty because he's responsible for what happened to their world.
I think that's I'm not sure if these are their children, meaning that this is their species, but just not as developed as they are because they used to be more like the species, this god thing, this race or whatever on this ship. And they even say it's not really a ship, which still confuses me, but they evolved into what they are now and these trans-dimensional beings. But before they were more like humans, like the way we are. So are these descendants of them? Are these beings that they brought, or the Edo beings that they brought from another planet to protect them and move them to this planet? There's so many factors in there. I don't know really what it is that they're protecting them from. But they also mentioned that they're actually protecting a certain sector of the galaxy, of this space. So it's more than the planet, because the Enterprise did help some colonists settle a planet nearby that apparently these godlike beings or whatever are protecting that sector of space too, that includes the planet that the colony's just on. So maybe this is an area of space that these trans-dimensional beings originally were from, and there was some attack, there was some invasion, some war that they eventually conquered and won, and they have continued to since protect this area of space from anybody else from intruding and trying to upset the balance of the peace that they have created there.
Could be, and it could have been an ancient battle, because if they have evolved to this point, maybe that happened when they were in humanoid form like us, right? And they've just been protecting this for so long. Yeah, it's a good point. Well, let's move on to the last topic here as we get close to an hour. And this is the question that I raised in the beginning, which is whether they undermined themselves, the writers undermined themselves with all the rewrites for this story. So, as I mentioned, this was the first episode commissioned to be written after the pilot episode, even though it wasn't produced until the 8th episode. And the original story had a bit more of a serious tone to it in terms of the planet, which I think probably would have made the message work better. It was written by John D.F. Black, but there were so many changes to it that he decided to use his pen name, which is Ralph Willis, on this show because he didn't want to put his name on it. And the basic idea was that the colony, which was not Rubicun III, it was called Laroth, had punishment zones that were designed to fight anarchy or to curb anarchy. And they had these zones, and the Enterprise crew went down. There was an officer who was protecting 2 children while on shore leave, and they stumbled upon a crime scene, and the Enterprise officer is shot and killed by a policeman, a Laroth police officer, whose partner then also shoots and kills him because of misunderstanding his actions. So these were sort of like the enforcers that we see in this episode. And so Picard decides to help the rebels who are rebelling against this authoritarian legal system. And they win, but then they establish their own totalitarian regime. And so then Picard has violated the Prime Directive, I suppose, because he's interfering with the internal workings of another society. And the outcome is negative. And this is where, a lot of these stories and the Prime Directive itself, I think, were designed to mirror U.S. intervention in foreign affairs, especially at the time, because there were various things happening, and that still happens today as well. And it's not just the U.S. Various countries are always interfering with other countries. And when you do that, what are the repercussions? Is the outcome going to be positive like you think it's going to be, or is the outcome going to be something equally bad, at least in your eyes? And so in the original story, it seems that's what happened. Picard helped one side and ended up just allowing another totalitarian regime to come to power. And then at the end, Picard sort of debates whether people have the right to decide their own justice without interference and to implement, as we were discussing earlier, an absolute system of law like we see with the Edo. Could they do that? So at the end, I suppose Picard's message is very similar to what we get in the episode that aired, but the framework is very different. So after all that explanation, Luke, my question would be, with a framework like that, would the message of the episode have worked better for you than what we got?
I feel like it might have been, yeah. That sounds, I guess, I don't know. They don't really get into it. Did your sources say if the B plot was basically the same? Like, were they still doing anything with the god or anything up above, or is it mostly focused on the surface?
I think it's mostly focused on the surface.
Okay.
This explanation comes from Memory Alpha. There's no mention of the god, and based on the rest of the story, I would suspect that there was no god element in it because it really is focused on the regime. To me, it's a much more earthly scenario. It's something that we can identify more easily as humans operating a society.
Yeah.
It's more straight science fiction to me, more like an SF novel than Star Trek, perhaps.
True. Yeah. I think just hearing the general synopsis of that story, it definitely sounds simpler. Like they could have focused a lot more on really communicating those themes effectively instead of the distractions with the free love society and the gods up above and all of that. So I definitely would have been interested to see that episode produced. And it's too bad. I wish we could be able to like compare the two, see where they come down.
Yeah, because it does sound like it would be a better episode. The framework sounds better, but it would be interesting to see how that would be executed, because the framework and the synopsis of a story is one thing, but then to see how it's actually produced is another. Mm-hmm. And if I were to read what we did get as a synopsis, I might say that sounds better. And I would probably not picture what they actually did with the episode and how they produced it and the clothing and the sexual and how they represent the sexuality, because it came off a bit goofy. So, it would be cool to compare if you had both of them produce and see which one would work better. But this scenario that you just brought up, Chris, sounds actually more interesting to me. And I like the fact that it doesn't really work in the God thing into it. I think it sounds more grounded and more real.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It definitely sounded like they could have maybe done more with that episode concept.
I think one element here that concerns me, a difference between the two, is that I think that what we got does something that Star Trek does from time to time. Certainly the original series and the Next Generation do this, which is to suggest that there's a naivety to the society that has this sort of system. Whereas the other story that we're talking about is more realistic in that I don't think that it's true that a society that becomes totalitarian does so because the people are naive and they simply allow that to be done to them. I think that there are complex factors that play into a society becoming totalitarian. And it suggests here that the Ito are just happy with this because they don't know any better and they're just not concerned with anything other than just making love and relaxing and playing at love, as Riven tells Riker earlier at the beginning of the episode. And I think that also sort of undermines the message, because if the message is a warning that justice cannot be absolute, that we have to use our brains and think about actions and punishments and think about how we structure fairness in a society, then to graft that onto a people who are simply naive and are presented as being very naive, I think that undermines the message. Because you can look at that and say, well, we're not like that, so this could never happen to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is something that comes up a fair amount in Star Trek, I think. The idea that we have these humans coming in representing the Federation, which is basically perfect, at least in earlier, like Gene Roddenberry, I believe, wanted the Federation to basically represent the best of humanity. So there weren't really any major problems within the Federation, and that's kind of a problem that we see come up every once in a while in Star Trek, where the humans come in and they know the best way to do things, and these other people, well, they're lower, or they're not as far along in their evolutionary development, or they're just not as smart as us, and because we know better, we can just tell them that they're wrong and that they need to do things the way we want them to. So yeah, I definitely saw some of that in this episode.
And I think one thing they were trying to get across in the way they did this episode compared to what you were talking about, Chris, is I think they wanted to also relay the message that this is paradise, and paradise is supposed to be perfect, and there is no such thing as perfect. There is no real paradise, because a paradise would not have rules of execution, of absolute of absolute laws. And so I think in the beginning of this episode, that's and going into it as it goes on, I think that's what they're trying to portray, is this is perfect. Who wouldn't want to be here? This is what everybody would. This is where you want to go on vacation. At least I know I would. But now that we see these laws and how they deal with the society and the execution, I wouldn't want to go there. And so, paradise is not always perfect.
Just stay away from the flowers, Bruce.
Just don't smell the flowers. You just might break them.
Yeah. One thing I did appreciate about this, even though in the end, of course, we are supposed to root for Picard and the crew of the Enterprise, I did appreciate that they did give Liator a moment to sort of recognize the implied superiority that Picard had, even though he wasn't trying to talk down to them, but there's still sort of an air of superiority there. So I did appreciate that the writers gave that character, I don't know, just I guess some, I don't know if clarity is the word you want to use, or maybe just some perspective. And the character called them out on that. And I really liked that he called them out on that. So.
Well, let's wrap up with our final thoughts and our ratings for this episode. So, Bruce, what are your final thoughts and what are you going to give this one?
Okay, my final thoughts are that this episode isn't as cheesy as it looks on the surface. There are some messages in there, as we discussed. I mean, the fact that we can have a discussion for this long and some deep discussions about the Prime Directive and about law and about the society and God and so forth sounds like a really good Star Trek episode. But I also don't think it works that well, because if I were to switch the channels and find something like this on TV, I would question about watching it. And just the fact that they run around in the diapers or whatever it is that they're wearing is a little ridiculous.
I love that they run everywhere. It's like, you need to go to the mailbox? Run. You need to go to the doctor? Run.
Right. You don't walk anywhere, you run. And I also questioned at the very beginning of this episode, the violation. I thought it may be a violation of the Prime Directive that Riker even went down to the planet, because from what we saw later, they're not in space and they don't have warp drive. And so I kind of questioned that too, but I gave that a pass. So it's not perfect, but I hate that. That's a pet peeve of mine when people say it's not perfect, because nothing ever is, just like Paradise. Yeah. But anyway, I will give this 3 Wesley cartwheels.
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up. If you watch on the Blu-ray, there is a stunt Wesley. There's a stunt Wesley doing the cartwheels, and you can just tell completely that it's not Will Wheaton. That's awesome.
Oh man, that's great.
Speaking of that, I also forgot to bring up the faux O'Brien in this episode.
I saw that. I wasn't sure if I saw that right or not. Yeah.
So faux O'Brien is fantastic, and what's also interesting about faux O'Brien is that he is played by Josh Clark, who is Carrie from Voyager. And so there is a little theory out there that maybe this actually is Carrie, because in terms of the timeline, you actually can work it out where Carrie could have been on the Enterprise D, later left, ended up getting posted to Voyager, and was on his way.
Absolutely, yeah.
Nice. I like that.
All right. So, Luke, what are your final thoughts and what's your rating?
Okay. In the end, I don't think this episode is as bad as it might be tempting to say it is. There definitely are some interesting ideas presented here, but in the end, with the I don't know, those ridiculous costumes, I just can't move past those, and I think that's just ultimately the ridiculous over-sexualization of the society was really brought down this episode. And as far as, like, even though there are some interesting ideas explored here, this is not an episode I recommend people watch. As far as like sharing it with other people who may not be as familiar with Star Trek, this is definitely towards the bottom of the list there. So in the end, I'm going to give it 5 FCC violations out of 10.
Okay, very good. Well, I don't know, Luke. I think I might recommend that people watch this episode at a party with a few drinks. Could be very entertaining. As I said, I was crying, laughing, watching this at the beginning yesterday. And then it turned very serious. It's interesting to me that it is like 2 episodes in one. You get that really fun aspect of Star Trek that you often get. And then you get that serious social commentary, which is what I love about Star Trek. It's just not packaged very well. It feels very disjointed, like the episode doesn't know what it wants to be. And also, I'm not a huge fan of this era of Star Trek social commentary where they really tell you what's right and what's wrong. I prefer Deep Space Nine, where they give you both sides and they really don't tell you which one you're supposed to agree with. They just present both sides to you, and then it's up to you to figure it out. That's my preferred approach to discussing pretty much anything. And here it's very clear, although I do agree in this case with the message that you can't have absolute justice. Sure. You have to have flexibility. Yeah. So this is one where I certainly do agree with the message that they're conveying. So I'm going to give this episode a tiny amount of fabric. All right. Well, Luke, thank you so much for joining us today. I mentioned at the beginning that you are a new member of the Trek FM crew, and that is because you are going to be taking over Hyperchannel from me. My work schedule has really not allowed me to continue doing that show, and you have a way of presenting news, which I think people will really enjoy. It's very informative, so I'd like to welcome you aboard.
All right. Thank you.
So that will start off pretty soon with the new episodes of Hyperchannel. Why don't you tell people quickly a little bit about your background?
Oh, well, let's see. Well, I was born once, so I started there.
Okay, that's
and
good.
And then, yeah, I'm sure that's the kind of detail you want.
You've never fallen into a flower bed, obviously.
So I've been working in radio for the past 8 years or so, and it's been a really great experience. I really learned a lot through that, and I've been interested in podcasting for quite a while. I tried out a sort of a trial run of a show last summer that had to do a sort of based around music. It was about news and music reviews, that sort of thing, and ultimately it was really fun to do, but it's just so much work, so it just didn't work out. But with Hyperchannel, I really liked that show early on. I started listening to it and subscribed, and I was subscribed to the first few episodes, and then I noticed that it stopped updating. And I was wondering, okay, that's
because I got a new job. That keeps me really busy.
I just noticed that I hadn't heard Hyperchannel in a while, and I noticed that it hadn't been updated for a couple months. And so I was just wondering, I remember, Chris, you had mentioned that your work schedule had changed quite a bit. So it seemed like a show that would be enjoyable to do. I like keeping up to date with all the latest news in Star Trek. So I think it'd be a really fun show to do.
Awesome. Well, we're glad to have you aboard. And again, that will start up pretty soon, everyone. So watch for episodes on that. And then, Luke, if people want to find you in social media or other things that you have going on, where should they look?
Sure. Still working on some of the social media stuff, getting that set up, although it might be set up by the time this episode is going out. For now, you can follow me on Twitter. I'm at CraptasticLuke. That's like fantastic, but with a crap instead of a fan. So at CraptasticLuke on Twitter.
Okay. Very good. All right. Well, thanks again for joining us today.
All right. Thank you so much, Chris.
Well, Chris, I had no idea how much fun that episode could be, and I'm glad Luke decided to wear full clothing for it.
I know. I'm so glad that he came in costume. I wish people could have seen that on camera. It really kept us in the mood throughout the discussion.
It was quite an interesting visual.
I was surprised that he chose the pink version of the outfit, though.
Yeah, I didn't even know they came in pink. I just assumed that he threw it in the wash with some reds and it bled onto it.
Maybe that's what it was. All right. But yeah, it was a fun discussion. And I'm glad that we had a mix of fun and serious, because that's one thing I do love about the Ready Room and about the Next Generation. Well, if you'd like to share your thoughts on Justice or on Discovery or on the DS9 documentary, the things we talked about today, there are many ways that you can get in touch with us. The best place to really take part in the broader discussion is to join us in the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field, and it should come right on up. If you're not yet a member, it is a closed group, so you'll need to click join, but then we'll let you in. And you can discuss these topics with your fellow listeners, as well as us and other hosts from the network right there in the group. If you're on Twitter, you can find us at TrekFM. That's our username. You can also send us an email if you go to trek.fm/contact. And you can send us a voicemail at speakpipe.com/trekfm. And we would love to hear your thoughts on today's show. I'd also like to take a moment and thank our associate producers on The Ready Room, Renee Roberts, Zachary Fruling, Sam Piasek, Kay Elizabeth Janeway, and Tim Robertson. They all support us through Patreon, and it's thanks to their support that we're able to get this show out to you. So thank you so much, Renee, Zachary, Sam, Kay, and Tim, for supporting The Ready Room. I really appreciate it so very, very much. And if you want to join them and become an associate producer, you can do that at patreon.com. Just go to patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to find out everything that you need to know. We have many different contribution levels. You can donate any amount that you like, but we do have milestone levels. You can see the perks associated with those, including becoming an associate producer. But we also have the roundtable where you can get on mic and you can talk Star Trek with fellow listeners and Trek FM hosts. And we have our special website, Patron Zone, and many other things over there. So we thank everyone who supports us through Patreon, and we hope that you will too. Again, the URL is patreon.com/TrekFM. So Bruce, when you're taking a break from running from here to there and there to here, where can people find you elsewhere on the network and around the interwebs?
Well, you can find me on Literary Treks with Matt Rushing and Dan Gunther, where we talk about the Star Trek books and comics. And I just love reading Star Trek books and comics, so I'm going to love talking about it with them. And if you like Star Wars, you can find me on the Star Wars Report with Riley Blanton and Mark Herleman. And I'm on Twitter at Admiral_Rex.
Very good. And then you're on Facebook as well, I think, in the Babel Conference too, aren't you?
Oh, yeah. I'm always in the Babel Conference. You can find me in there. So, shoot me a message in there too. I'm always participating.
You're always hanging out over by the buffet table with all the colorful food, right?
I am, but I'm really starting to think about hanging out in this Ready Room because it's plush.
Very good. All right. Well, if you want to find me, you can find me in the Babel Conference also. I'm there, and I'm there on Facebook. And my username is C. Brian Jones there, pretty much everywhere in social media. So if you're on Twitter, you can find me, C. Brian Jones, the letter C, and Brian with a Y. Elsewhere on the network, you can find me, as I mentioned in the show today, doing The Orb with Matthew Rushing, which is our Deep Space Nine podcast. You can also find me on the first 80 or so episodes of Literary Treks, if you want to go listen to that show. I used to co-host that with Matthew Rushing. And you can also find my writing about Star Trek over on the official website at StarTrek.com. Just search for my name, again, C. Brian Jones. Do it as 3 different elements there on that website, and those articles should come on up. Well, Bruce, I'm going to head back out because I have to go clean up that flower bed. They wanted to actually punish me as well. I don't know why. I don't have anything to do with Wesley Crusher, and I'm not a boy. But I got out of it by agreeing to put all the flowers back into place and rebuild the covering.
Oh, I'm so glad you're not going to be executed because we need you back here. But right now it's time to stick a drop of the hat in it because the Ready Room is done.